We're back with our third video. If you haven't watched before, I'm Joyce Wiggins from the Monroe County Historical Society in Woodsfield, Ohio. Our third video in 2020's children program is entitled Summer Fun When the Work is Done. We will be featuring children of all ages having fun as well as doing jobs and chores at home and away from home. I'll be reading excerpts from a book whose setting is 1934 during the Great Depression. We'll be getting to know a boy named Will who was homeless and traveled from town to town looking for odd jobs that would pay him money, food, or lodging. In 1934, folks like Will were called hobos. Today we call them homeless. We will also be learning about summer jobs and chores and work that children can do to earn a bit of their own money, maybe even learn a trade, as well as things children just simply do to help their parents. Then we'll take a closer look at what children do for fun in these long summer days. First, let's take a look at this fellow Will. Kit had knelt down and gone back to picking when Grace barked a friendly bark. Grace was supposed to be a guard dog, but she seemed to think that anyone who came to the house only came to admire her and therefore should be welcomed. Kit poked her head up above the tomatoes she was picking. "Hey," said someone. Kit turned and saw a stranger standing at the edge of the garden. It was a teenage boy in a dusty cap and stained, baggy, roughly patched trousers. "Hey, yourself," said Kit. Now Sterling raised his head too. The teenage boy grinned such a big wide grin that Kit and Sterling had to smile back. Kit knew he was a hobo. He had the same scruffy, scrawny look as all the hobos and tramps who came to the house looking for a handout or a job to do in return for food. The boy bent down to scratch Grace's back. He nodded toward the garden. "Those tomatoes look good," he said. Just then the screen door opened and Aunt Millie came out. The boy's grin disappeared. He shot straight up, pulled his cap off, pushed his shaggy dark hair out of his eyes, and said, "How do you do, ma'am?" He sounded as if he half expected Aunt Millie to shoo him away. But Kit knew Aunt Millie would never shoo even a stray dog away, much less a stray boy. "What can I do for you, son?" Aunt Millie asked. "Well, ma'am," said the boy, "I was just saying to the young lady yonder, that's a good crop of tomatoes you've got. Your string beans are ready to be picked, too. I'll be glad to help. Looks like maybe you could use a hand." "Looks like maybe you could use a bite to eat," said Aunt Millie. "You're as skinny as a string bean yourself." The boy grinned his wide, wonderful grin again. "I'd be obliged," he said, "but not until after I work." Aunt Millie smiled. "What's your name, son?" "Will Shepherd," the boy answered, "but nowadays most folks call me Texas Will or just plain Will." "All right, just plain Will," said Aunt Millie. She handed him an empty basket. "You can help Kit and Sterling with the picking. Mind you, there won't be any pay in it for you, none but lunch anyway." "That'll do fine, ma'am," said Will. He bent over a tomato plant and went straight to work. "I'll tell the folks inside there'll be one more for lunch," said Aunt Millie, and she went back into the kitchen. Kit was burning with curiosity about Will. She had hundreds of questions to ask him. Also, she wanted to hear Will talk some more. She liked the way he pronounced his name, Will, and called Aunt Millie ma'am. "Are you from Texas?" Kit asked. "Yep," Will answered without stopping his work. How'd you get as far as Cincinnati?" Sterling asked. "Riding the rails mostly," said Will. "Hopping freights. I ride freight trains for free by jumping into empty boxcars." "Aren't you kind of young?" Kit asked. "To be a hobo, I mean?" "I'm 15, said Will. "There's lots of hobos my age, some even younger," and he glanced at Kit. "Girls not much older than you ride the rails." "They do?" Kit said, fascinated. "Yep," said Will. "Oh my," thought Kit, "what a life that must be. Very exciting and very unstuck." Let's take a break here and talk about gardens and growing food. I have a little display set up here from things that you could grow in your garden and sell at a roadside stand or use for your family to eat. People have always planted and tended and harvested vegetables and fruits to feed themselves and their families. Gardens for vegetables and trees and bushes and vines for fruit have always been a very inexpensive way to feed a lot of people. Gardens and orchards, however, take a lot of hard and sometimes back-breaking work. Children through the ages have always had the chores of helping plant and weed and then pick the vegetables and fruits, and oftentimes family have enough of their own for their own use, and they sell the extras by the side of the road. I can remember as a very little girl, we had a huge strawberry patch. I was too little to pick much of anything, but my older siblings did. After Mom made many jars of strawberry jam, they sold the rest of the strawberries to folks in town. We also had a big row of black raspberries and a lot of wild blackberries. As I got older, I remember picking those until my hands were purple. We would pick late at night or early in the morning, and then Dad would take them into town and we would sell them door to door. I remember one summer I made $60 selling blackberries. I was allowed to spend that money on something I wanted that my folks didn't have the money to buy. I bought an alarm clock radio for my bedroom. It had a pillow speaker that you could put under your pillow so you didn't wake the family up if you were listening to the radio. I believe today kids use earphones or earbuds or something like that. I also bought a set of suitcases that summer so I had something to take on trips and sleepovers with friends. Just as Will helped Kit's family in the garden, children today of all ages help their parents in gardens. Here are some wonderful pictures of today's children working in gardens, planting, harvesting, and even one of a crew of kids pulling weeds in a large soybean field. Some of these pictures have kids simply helping their parents, while others are actually working at a summer job to make some extra spending money. I wonder what Will is up to. Will was a quiet, quick worker. With his help, all the ripest tomatoes were picked by lunchtime. Mother brought a tray of sandwiches outside, and Dad brought a pitcher of milk so they could have lunch on the shady back porch. Will looked at the sandwiches as if he could devour them all. Kit knew how he felt. She was always hungry herself. Mother often teased that Kit was eating them out of house and home. But before they could eat, Aunt Millie brought a basin of hot water and a bar of soap and a hand towel. "Wash up, children," she ordered Kit and Sterling and Will. Kit and Sterling washed quickly, but Will pushed up his sleeves, plunged his hands into the hot water, and sighed with pleasure. He lathered up his hands, cupped them, and scooped up handful after handful of water to wash his face, letting the warm soapy water run down his neck. Then he scrubbed his arms up to his elbows and dried off with a towel. Water drops glistened on his hair. Kit realized that soap and hot water were luxuries that hobos like Will probably didn't often have. "You're a good worker, Will," said Aunt Millie as she filled his milk glass. You know what you're doing in a garden." "I ought to," said Will with his winning grin. "My family had a farm back in Texas." "Don't you miss your family?" asked Mother. "Oh, I do, ma'am," answered Will, "and I miss the farm. It used to be beautiful. My father grew wheat. In the spring the field looked like a green ocean. Then hard times came. My father couldn't make any money selling his wheat, and after that it seemed like nature turned against us because it never rained. The wheat dried up dead and brown, and it cracked under your feet. The soil was nothing but dust," Will sighed. "A couple of big windstorms came and just blew the farm away, scattered it. My family's gone too. They packed up everything and left." That happened during what we call the Dust Bowl in our country. "How come you didn't go with them?" Kit asked Will. "Kit," Mother scolded gently, "that's an awful personal question." "It's all right, ma'am," said Will. He looked at Kit. "You see, my father was a proud man. It almost killed him when he lost the farm and couldn't feed us anymore. And I knew he hated having me see him brought so low. I knew I was one more mouth he couldn't feed and one more pair of feet he couldn't buy shoes for. So when my family packed up to leave Texas, I made up my mind to go off on my own. I figured it was time for me to take care of myself." "Did you run away?" Sterling asked. "Yep," said Will. "I've been almost everywhere since then. I follow the crops. I went north to harvest potatoes in the fall, south to pick walnuts in the winter, and east to pick strawberries in the spring. Now I'm on my way west to Oregon for the apple harvest." Dad spoke, and Kit heard something that sounded like envy in his voice. "You've seen a lot of country for someone your age," he said to Will. "Yes, sir, and I met a lot of folks too," said Will, "but none kinder than you." He stood up and put his cap back on his head. "I thank you now for fine lunch. I'll be on my way." Dad glanced at Mother and Aunt Millie, and all three seemed to come to an agreement without saying a word. Kit was happy when he heard Dad say, "Just a minute, Will. We're going to be up to our elbows picking and preserving tomorrow, too. We'd be glad to have your help if you would stay. We can't pay you, but we'll feed you and give you a place to sleep. And I'll give you a haircut," said Aunt Millie. "You look like you haven't had one since you left home." Will's grin lit up his whole face. "Thanks," he said. "I'd like that. I'll stay." "Good," said Kit. "You can tell us all about the places you've been." Well, Will certainly has quite a story to tell. Here in Monroe County during the Great Depression that began when the stock market crashed in 1929, people got worried and took all their money out of the banks. Families that lived on a farm actually didn't see too much of a change. They had cows to give them milk, and that milk made butter and cheese. They also raised a steer or two for beef to eat, and that gave them meat. They raised chickens so that they could have eggs and meat. Some maybe raised a pig or two for ham and bacon. They planted big gardens and preserved everything they could so they had food to eat all winter long. Some of the things they couldn't raise were sugar and coffee. Many had to do without those items because they were very expensive. Folks that lived in towns actually had a harder time. Their yards simply weren't big enough to have all those farm animals, and therefore they had to do without a lot of meat. Their yards turned into gardens, and like Kit's family, were kept very busy preserving food for the winter months ahead. I'm curious about this boy Will, who calls himself a hobo. I wonder what he's doing now. The next day, Kit was hanging sheets on the clothesline. A soft, hot, sultry wind lifted the sheets so that they fluttered like white wings around her. Aunt Millie had set up an open-air barber shop next to the clothesline. She had cut Sterling's hair, and now she was at work on Will's. "I sure appreciate this, ma'am," he said. "I don't meet barbers in the jungle." "What's the jungle?" asked Sterling. "Well, that's what we hobos call our camps," explained Will. "A jungle is usually close to the railroad tracks. There's one here in Cincinnati near Union Station right next to the river." Do you cook over a campfire? Asked Kit dreamily. And tell stories about the places you've been and sing songs and sleep out under the stars? Well, Will began as if he were starting a long explanation. Then he simply answered, "Yep, we do." "I've seen some of those camps," Aunt Millie said, snipping through Will's thick hair with her sharp scissors. "They look mighty uncomfortable. Hot in the summer, cold in the winter, wet in the rain, and buggy to boot." "Maybe," said Kit, "but there's no rugs to beat or gutters to clean, and you could come and go as you please. It sounds just fine to me." Aunt Millie shook her head. "A wanderer's life is lonely and hard," she said. "I believe most people are good-hearted, but not everyone is kind to hobos." She untied the cloth she'd put around Will's shoulders and shook the hair off of it. "You're done, just plain, Will," she said, "and much improved, if I must say so myself." "Thank you, ma'am," said Will as Aunt Millie went inside. Will stood up and brushed off his pants. "I am sure glad I stopped here," he said to Kit and Sterling. "Why did you stop here? Why did you stop at our house?" Kit asked. "How did you know we'd be nice?" "I saw the sign," said Will. "What sign?" said Kit and Sterling together. "Come," Will said, lifting his head toward the fence. "I'll show you." Kit and Sterling followed Will to the corner of the yard where the fence met the street. "Look," he said. On the fence post, someone had drawn a sketch of a cat. "That sign means a kind-hearted woman lives here." "Oh," exclaimed Kit. "Are there other signs, too?" "Yep," said Will, "lots of them. They're a secret code that we hobos use to tell each other what to expect in the places that we go. Usually the sign is scratched on a fence or drawn on a building or a sidewalk with chalk or coal." "Can you show us more?" asked Kit. "Sure," said Will. Sterling, who liked to draw, always had a pencil stub and a piece of paper in his pocket, so he gave the pencil and paper to Will now. Will drew one horizontal line. "One line means it's a doubtful place, you better not stop here." 3 lines. He added 3 more lines and explained, "But 4 lines means the lady of the house will give you food if you do the chores." He drew a circle with 2 arrows pointing out of it, one on each side of the circle. "This means get out fast." And then he drew a big V. He said, "This means pretend to be sick." "Why would you do that?" asked Sterling. "Well, if you pretend to be sick, sometimes folks will help you and feed you." "But isn't it lying to fake an illness?" "I suppose it is," said Will. "But on the road sometimes you have to do whatever it takes to survive." "Did you ever steal?" asked Kit. Will took a deep breath. "Let me ask you this. If you worked all day helping a farmer harvest potatoes, and at the end he gives you a wormy potato in pay for your labor, do you think it's stealing if you slip another good one in your pocket?" Kit and Sterling didn't know how to answer. "Hunger changes rules sometimes," said Will. He drew a circle with a square and put a dot in the middle. This is the sign that you'll see on a farmer's post that is stingy. It means a bad-tempered man lives there. "Signs aren't the only way hobos help each other," said Will. "When hobos ride into town on the train, we go to the jungle. Then we spread out and look for chores to do for food. Maybe I sweep out a store and a storekeeper will give me a couple onions. I bring them back to the jungle and put them together with everyone else's food to make what we call hobo stew. See, onions alone aren't great, but if you put them in a pot of stew, then there's more food for all and it tastes better too." "Hobo stew," said Kit, savoring those words. "I wish I could try some." In our world today, many folks don't have a home to call their own. They too live in camps, under bridges, or stop off at homeless shelters to get food, a shower, and a dry place to sleep. Many of them have lost their money and their homes because they've lost their jobs. Sometimes it's overwhelming for us to know what to do to help them. We can help by giving food to food pantries, volunteering at soup kitchens, donating our clothes when we've grown them out of them to thrift shops, and working with your church groups to make things for people like health supplies, hygiene products, non-perishable food packets. A friend of mine named Annette saw an idea to help people who didn't have beds in which to sleep and started a project with her 6th grade students to help the homeless. They collected plastic grocery bags, cut them into strips, knotted them together, and rolled the plastic into balls like yarn, only it's called plarn. Then those who could crochet made that plarn into mats for homeless people to sleep on the ground. What a great way to use up plastic bags, and how good it must be to get one of those mats if you don't have a bed to sleep on. There's something I'd like to ask of you. If it's not possible to do any of these things I've just talked about, I'd like to tell you that there is something that you can do that won't cost anything, but it will make life a whole lot more bearable for all. Be kind to others. Don't be a part of making fun of anyone. Talk to all kids, include them in your play and games, and look for the good in everyone you see. The next part of our video is going to take a look at other jobs that young people do today and compare how those jobs were done 100 or maybe even 200 years ago. Many boys and girls get jobs for the summer mowing yards. Some folks don't have time to mow their own yards, and many are not able to mow because of their health or age. Lawn mowing has changed over the years, and I would like to share some photos and demonstrations of some very old equipment as well as modern day machines that do the same job. The first photo here is a young man using one of the first methods of cutting grass. That machine is a sickle. The small curved blade would be kept very sharp so that it could quickly cut off plants of any kind right at the ground. This tool would have been used to cut a small area of grass, maybe hay, weeds, or even garden plants after they were no longer producing. This next tool looks similar, only it's much larger in size. It's called a scythe. This would have been used to cut much larger areas of grass, or hay, or wheat, or even weeds that grew on banks along the roads. You might still today see someone using one of these cutters, but most of them have been replaced with something that runs by a motor. Today we call them weed whackers or weed eaters. Let's get back to lawns. Wealthy folks for centuries took great pride in beautifully cut lawns. People were always looking for ways to make jobs easier. If you had a big lawn, you could stake out some sheep or goats or maybe even a cow to eat the grass and weeds down. No doubt pioneers in the United States did that often. It would have done 2 jobs at once: mowed the grass and fed the animal. You might even see that done today sometimes. It would be a great plan if you don't mind cleaning up droppings of manure after the lawn had been eaten, or even worse, imagine one of those pesky living lawnmowers getting loose and mowing down your mother's beautiful flower garden, or worse yet, your entire vegetable garden. Those things taste good to animals too. No, something had to be invented to cut grass that would be done in a very orderly manner. If you're interested in the history of lawn mowing, Google it. You'll be amazed. I'm just going to show you a brief progression of lawn mowers in Monroe County. This first one is operated solely by the gears and wheels and the person pushing it. The next one is a very similar one to that, except that somebody attached a motor to make the blades turn faster and easier, thus making a cleaner cut for your grass. Today, of course, the lawnmower looks even more deluxe. And yes, don't forget those who don't want to walk it. You guessed it. We know now that if you're going to mow grass and mow very much at all, you'll need a riding lawnmower like this one. Boys and girls out there mowing grass for folks, whether you're getting paid to do it or simply helping do your part at home, it's certainly a lot easier to do today than it was 200 years ago, even just 100 years ago. Something tells me we need to go back to our book and see if there's more about Will. Will said his thank yous and goodbyes early that afternoon, explaining that he had to spend the night in the jungle. He had planned to spend the night in the jungle near Union Station and then hop a freight headed west the next day. Kit was sorry to see him go. It's duller than ever around here, she griped at Sterling later that day as they took the dry sheets off the clothesline. Will's the only interesting thing that happened around here all summer. Sterling agreed. I liked hearing about the jungle and the hobos. I liked those secret signs that Will taught us, too. Didn't that hobo stew sound good? Asked Kit. All at once she gasped. Oh, no. We didn't give Will anything for his stew. They looked at each other in dismay. You know what? I'll bet if we asked, Mother and Aunt Millie would give us some food, and we could take it down to the jungle near the Union Station and give it to Will. I don't know. Sterling began to doubt. Listen, Sterling, Kit interrupted. Remember that stingy farmer with the wormy potato that Will told us about? Sterling nodded. Well, we're worse than that farmer if we don't give Will some tomatoes and beans that he picked. We owe Will some food for the stew. He worked hard helping us, didn't he? Sterling nodded again. Besides, aren't you just dying to see the jungle? I am. She hoisted the laundry basket on her hip and said, as soon as I finish my chores, I'm going to talk to the grown-ups. Then we're going to go find Will. Talking to the grown-ups had taken longer than expected. Mrs. Howard said the jungles were dangerous. But luckily, Aunt Millie had persuaded her that most hobos were just folks who were down on their luck and that going to the jungle would be a generous and educational thing for Kit and Sterling to do. Mrs. Howard fussed, but she finally gave in after Sterling promised not to eat any of the hobo stew. Otherwise, she was sure he'd come down with some dreadful disease. Now, finally, Kit and Sterling were on their way with a flour sack bag full of food that Aunt Millie had packed. There were fresh tomatoes and beans from the garden, a can of stewed tomatoes, and a can of milk. Kit's stomach was fluttery. She was an honest girl, and she admitted to herself that she wanted to bring the food to the hobos, not just out of kindness, but also out of curiosity. And no matter what Mrs. Howard said, she was going to taste that hobo stew. It was not a very long walk to Union Station from Kittredge's house. Very shortly, Kit and Sterling passed the huge front of the train station. They continued past the rail yards to the riverbank underneath the trestle bridge. There, almost hidden in a little grove of trees, was a cleared-out space of bare ground with a smoky fire in the middle of it. We're here, breathed Kit to Sterling. This is the jungle. Kit and Sterling looked around with wide eyes. Somehow the jungle was not as comfortable looking as Kit had imagined. There were a few tumble-down shelters made from old boards leaning against trees, a few dirty tents that sagged tiredly, and the people looked tired too. Some were washing their clothes in the river and spreading them out on bushes to dry. One man was shaving standing at a cracked mirror hung from a tree branch. But most of the hobos were stretched out on the ground, hard asleep, their hats covering their faces. Someone was playing a soft, haunting tune on a harmonica. The air smelled of wood smoke and coffee and stew. Kit was glad to see Will coming toward her. Hey, says Will. Kit and Sterling, what are you doing here? Kit took the food out of the sack. We came to give you this food for the hobo stew, she said. We're sorry we forgot before. Will grinned. Well, thanks, he said. Will used a sharp rock to open the cans. I just found out something yesterday on one of those game shows I was watching. They made canned food 40 years before they made can openers. And you had to either break open the top of the can with a rock or a hammer and a chisel. Can you imagine what an invention a can opener must have been? I just found that out last night. Will used a sharp rock to open the cans. He lifted the lid from the pot and added the canned tomatoes and the fresh tomatoes and the beans from the garden and stirred the stew, and then he gave Kit a taste. It was very spicy. In a moment, a woman came to the fire and filled 3 bowls from the pot. Kit was sadly surprised when she saw that the woman was bringing the stew to very small, very hungry-looking children. One of the children was practically a baby. Will gave the young mother the can of milk. Then he looked at Kit's face. What's the matter, he asked. Kit said slowly, I didn't expect to see those little kids here. She had assumed that hobos were people like Will who had chosen to live this adventurous life on the road. Now she understood that most of them were poor, lost people, families with tiny babies even, who had once been settled and respectable, but now, because of the Depression, had no place to call home. Kit saw the young mother's husband was asleep. He had tied his shoes to his wrist. "Why did he do that?" Kit asked Will quietly. "He's afraid someone will steal his shoes while he's sleeping," explained Will. "A hobo's shoes are his most valuable possession. You can't get anywhere without shoes." Kit looked around at the other hobos. They were wearing street shoes, tennis shoes, old rubber boots, shoes with pieces of tire nailed to the bottom, mismatched hiking boots, even rags wrapped around their feet and legs and tied on with a rope. One boy had taken off a huge pair of 4-buckle galoshes. He wore 2 pairs of socks, and he was stuffing crumpled newspaper into the toes of the galoshes to make them fit. Another man was repairing his boots, which were clearly too small for him. When Kit saw his feet, she was heartsick and a little ashamed of herself. Why, the way her shoes pinched her toes was nothing compared to this poor man's feet that were rubbed raw and bleeding. Kit's attention was suddenly distracted by a noisy group of men arriving in the jungle. They greeted the others and squatted down by the fire. "Freight train must have pulled in," Will explained to Kit and Sterling. We're going to leave Will now and get back to the rest of the video. If you're interested in reading more about their adventures of these characters, Will and Kit and Sterling, you'll find them in a book called Kit Saves the Day by Valerie Tripp. You noticed that Will and Kit and Sterling were expected to help out to keep things running smoothly. Hopefully you too live in the kind of a family where everyone pitches in to do the chores and work that needs to be done in or outside your home. Sometimes we take on the notion that we have to get paid for everything we do. As we grow up, we realize that our parents work hard at their jobs to be able to give us the things we need, and yes, even some of the things that we want. I grew up on a farm where the work was hard, but the rewards were great. Now, before you go thinking I was one of those fancy kids that got an allowance, let me set you straight. I don't think my dad and mom had a lot of money, but what they had, they knew how to stretch, and I really never felt poor. I grew up having a big family that loved me, a church family where friends were plentiful, and lots of good food to eat, a nice bed to sleep in, and a life made very interesting for me because I loved to read. Let's look at some children today doing jobs and chores with their families to make life in their home a wonderful place to be. Now, you know what they say, all work and no play makes Johnny a dull boy. These same kids who have shared their work photos and a lot of fun times too, have a lot of fun times too. Let's take a look at them playing in the water, at the playground, in the woods, camping and cooking and eating out, vacation Bible school, and much, much more.
When I was but a boy in days of childhood, I used to play till evening shadows come. Then winding down an old familiar pathway, I heard my mother call and said, "Oh, son, come home, it's supper time. The shadows lengthen fast. Come home, it's supper time. We're going home at last." When I was but a boy in days of childhood, I used to play till evening shadows come. Then winding down an old familiar pathway, I heard my mother call and said, "Oh, son, come home, it's supper time. The shadows lengthen fast. Come home, it's supper time. We're going home at last."
Our next section of summer fun features camping and campfires and all the delicious food that goes along with it.
Take me home to the
Now, wasn't that some fun being had by some hardworking children? I hope you've enjoyed this video. Our last video this summer is going to be called Back to School. None of us know exactly what school's going to be like this year, but we'd like to see some of your favorite things from past school years. I'll be giving you bits of history about schools in Monroe County for the past 200 years. At the end of the credits is my email address, so if you'd like to get in touch with me if you have pictures, that'd be great. Hope the rest of your summer is safe and happy.